Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Octopus 101 for August 7th, 2025. Thank you for joining us today. My name is John Bristowe. Thank you for your time and attention joining us on this monthly webinar that we do every month called the Octopus 101. Its purpose or intention is to basically give you a leg up or an exposure to Octopus. If you haven't seen Octopus before, don't worry, you're in the right place. This is the place where we show you how Octopus works, what it does, etc., and more importantly, why you should consider it for doing continuous delivery. By way of introduction, my name is John Bristowe. I'm a member of the team here at Octopus Deploy. Again, thank you and welcome to today's webinar. If you have any questions at any time during today's webinar, feel free to submit your questions via social media, wherever you're joining us on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, whatever. You can submit your questions there. We'll post them as comments and then we'll go ahead and answer them live. This is live. And to that end, if you miss any part of this and you're like, hey, what did I see there? I didn't catch that. Don't worry, everything is recorded and you'll be able to find us up on our YouTube channel. Our YouTube channel has a lot of great videos there worth checking out, and you'll find us available at youtube.com/Octopus Deploy. So make sure to like and subscribe, as the kids say. So there you go. Anyway, so this is about 35 minutes of what is Octopus Deploy, how it works, why you should consider using it. And so, again, if you have been invited here by one of our fine folks here at Octopus Deploy, or you were curious yourself as to what Octopus Deploy was all about, don't worry, you're in the right place. To that end, we also have a bunch of great webinars that you can also take a look at octopusdeploy.com/webinars, and there you'll find a bunch of webinars that we have coming up this month. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk a little bit about Octopus and what it is and how it works. So in this webinar, we're going to talk about, as I said, how it works and why you should consider using it. We're talking about Octopus in terms of a continuous delivery solution. So Octopus is a solution that helps you do deployments. And so we'll talk about not only those things, but also some of the fundamental things about Octopus. So Octopus as a product, you need to understand some of the fundamental concepts we have. So we're going to talk about features like projects. We'll talk about things like deployment processes, releases. By the end of this webinar, you'll be able to go up to anyone that you know and tell them about Octopus yourself. That is my intention, is to make the train the trainer sort of thing here. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how to create a deployment process. We'll talk about how to create a deployment process from scratch, and we'll take a look at some examples of deployment processes that are used live today, and we'll give you a sense of how these things work. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about how you integrate Octopus Deploy as part of your pipeline. So Octopus itself is not an island. It's actually part of a whole suite of tools that you may use in a pipeline. And so how do you trigger a deployment process from, say, your CI process or server? We'll talk a little bit about that. CI stands for continuous integration. It's the process by which you build and test code. And typically, it's the starting point of a pipeline. Typically, not always, but typically. And so we'll talk a little bit about how you can kickstart a deployment from something like, say, GitHub Actions. Of course, we have integrations with other types of tools, Jenkins, TeamCity, etc. There's all kinds of integrations we have. So that's the lay of the land, and so hopefully that will expose you well to Octopus going forward. So let's talk a little bit about what the state of the art is today. So on the left-hand side of this diagram, we have our developers, they write code, and on the right side is our targets. These are the places we want to push code to. So we want to deploy to these locations. Somewhere in the middle, as I said before, you have a CI process or build process. And typically, this is how a lot of code is built today. You typically submit code in the form of, if you're using Git, in the form of a PR. And then from there, you may have some automations that kick off that trigger a workflow. An example of this might be GitHub Actions, for example. There's a pipeline integration in Azure DevOps, for example. There are YAML integrations within Jenkins. These workflows basically trigger some sort of execution of code, code that builds code, code that tests code. And then there, you hand that off, that artifact that you build, the DLL, the exe, the O file, whatever it is that you're actually deploying, the zip, the tarball, etc. You then pass that over as a package to Octopus Deploy, and then Octopus Deploy does all the rest from there. And so that's essentially how Octopus Deploy fits at a 50,000-foot view. If we're thinking a little bit about how life is before and after Octopus, of course, there's a lot of ways in which you can consider this. Without Octopus, we like to think of this as just a myriad of scripts floating in space all over the place. And this is not a a very good situation because obviously these scripts need to be maintained. It's a lot of DIY sort of pipeline maintenance, etc. And so it can be a challenge to have a safe and sane way to evolve these things, to improve them, etc. And so with Octopus Deploy, you get an environment by which you can actually it makes it easy for teams to self-service application releases, and more importantly, democratizes how you deliver software. That's one of the expressions we use a lot here at Octopus. And so with Octopus Deploy, you get a really nice way of actually evolving these deployments. Another way to look at this, of course, is in the myriad of tools you may use. So in the sort of typical environment you may have when trying to implement CD, this is often a Herculean effort. This is done by typically one or two folks within your org who has the sense of, I want to do CD, but it's tough, right? Because in addition to all the tools that I'm using, which are surrounding in this orbit around my code, I have to maintain my own environments. I have to maintain my own scripts, etc. I may have a bunch of other tools as well. kubectl, for example, for doing deployments to Kubernetes clusters. These and other sorts of variables are difficult for me to contend with because there's just so much stuff gravitating around my source code. And so with Octopus Deploy, we like to consolidate that under one roof. And so Octopus Deploy provides that area where we take over where your, another expression we use is where your CI server ends, that's where Octopus begins. And so we model basically your entire release orchestration process of software. And that includes things like release versioning, deployment automation, configuration management, approvals and ITSM integration. All these things are listed here. These and other things are part of that story. And so if we take a look at how this might integrate at, say, a GitHub perspective, so if you're using GitHub, a very popular platform, you may utilize this in a bunch of different ways. We have integration points, and this theme actually permeates across different types of integrations as well. But if you're thinking of just GitHub, we have integration with VS Code through our Octopus Deploy extension for GitHub. We have a bunch of GitHub actions available on the GitHub Marketplace. We integrate with container registries available from GitHub or other places like Docker Hub or JFrog Artifactory. You can then integrate that as part of the story that I just mentioned before. So when thinking about this, you can think of Octopus Deploy as the centerpiece of your pipeline, and it provides all that orchestration that you need for doing deployments of software. Awesome. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into a demo, everyone's favorite part. All right, for that purpose, let me go ahead and bring up my environment here. Ta-da, there we go, through the magic of software. There you go. All right, so what you're seeing here is the deployment dashboard for Octopus itself. So this is kind of like Octopus in a nutshell. This is the most popular view that you have within your Octopus view. It's the dashboard which shows everything that you need to know about where your deployments stand. And so here you'll see across the top here, we have a bunch of projects. So inside here, we have projects that are contained within these groups. And these projects here, you'll notice, have these little labels here like environment and test and staging. These are your environments that you use to deploy to. And notice that this is nice because at a glance, I can quickly see what the status of each one of my deployments is at. So I can see here that this version of this project here has been successfully deployed to my development environment, or this one over here, this different project here has been also successfully deployed. If we jump into one of these, for example, and we take a look at the deployments that have been done, we can drill into the latest deployment that is reflected on the dashboard. So the deployment itself is part of what's called a release. And we'll talk about that in a second. But basically what I get a sense here is, what were all the steps that successfully executed to do this release? What does the log file look like? I can get a verbose log file listing of this if I wanted to. I can see a listing of all the steps that occurred for this deployment process. I can also track things like history, who deployed it, why they deployed it, for example, because you can annotate that. So we get traceability and logging as part of this, which is great. Oftentimes you want to know who did the last deployment. It's kind of like Git blame, but for deployments in a sense. I can also see the changes that went into this. If I had those changes propagated, we have an integration here called build information. We haven't used it for this project here, but all the commits that go into formulating a deployment will be listed here. Okay. So this is essentially the end product of when you've done a successful deployment. But you might wonder, like, what does it look like when you're actually building a deployment for the first time? So let's assume that I have an application. It's the world's greatest application, and now I want to deploy it. So I set up a project here, and then what I do is I describe the deployment process via this mechanism here. So when I jump into the process listing here on the left-hand side, I have the ability of defining my deployment process as a series of steps. So steps are the building blocks of how you define a deployment. You use steps in a collection to define do this, do this, do this, do this, and then my deployment has succeeded. Along the way, when you define these steps, you can actually put conditions around them. So you can have conditions that say when a certain step fails, or when it does fail or doesn't fail, etc. I can actually do certain actions. So these and other sorts of things I can certainly set up if I so wish. Oh, my webcam went off there for a second. All right, let's see if I can get back to. All right, there we go. Sorry. You see it's live, so there you go. Okay, so let's take a look at how we might want to add additional steps to this. So if I go ahead and click on add a step, here you see the process editor. This is where we modify an existing or define a new deployment process. The deployment process is essentially the lifeblood of Octopus. And in here, you'll notice when we scroll down, we have a bunch of categories that we can define our steps as. So we have a bunch of steps that we ship out of the box. Many, many steps that will help you build a deployment process very easily. So you can see here we have steps for running scripts. We have steps here for integration with Docker. We have steps here if you're utilizing Terraform. You can plan and apply templates if you so wish. We have steps for native cloud services. So if you're doing anything with Azure, AWS, Cloud, Google Cloud, etc., these are all integrated there. And these are basically the building blocks of how you define your deployment process. Now, if there's a step that we don't include out of the box, don't worry. We have this option here called community steps. If you click on this, you'll notice there's over 570 steps that we have available for you to use as part of the community. So the community has built these out so that you can use these. So if you're looking to integrate with Pingdom, or I'm just picking random ones here. Let's say I want to use a Redis backend and I wanted to deploy that, or maybe I'm integrating with Redgate, etc. These and other steps are available for you to use as part of your deployment process. So we've got your back essentially from that perspective. Now, inside here, I already have a step defined. This is the well that allows me to define the series of steps that are created. If I wanted to, I could add an additional step. And let's take a look at what actually shows up here when I do that. So a step has a bunch of knobs and buttons to it. It's very much like the cockpit of an airplane. There's lots of things you can do with these things. The important matter to mention here is that a script step is the simplest of steps. It's basically like, let me take the wheel and drive. I'm going to write a script that defines a part of my deployment process. And this is actually our most popular step based on analytics. So a lot of people use this step. So a script itself falls under this category here. You can see this is a banner here we have called script. And inside here, you can see we have a bunch of options that I can define. So the reason why there's lots of options here is not to introduce complexity, but rather to show you the power and flexibility we have with each one of these steps. Every step itself is customizable in its own way. So if I were to use a different step here, I'd have different options. That being said, there are a bunch of universal options that are defined across steps. So if we run a script, what are we doing? We're running a set of code, and that code can be defined in a number of locations. So that code can come from, say, something that I define inline right within Octopus. I can also point to a Git repository. It's like, go over there, somewhere over there in Git, and go find a script that I'm using, whether it's in a package like an archive, like a tarball, a zip file, etc., or it's some file that I want to use there. Alternatively, I can actually use a package itself and reference a package repository. So a package is just that. It's a arbitrary file that I can use, and I can, with Octopus, we can actually crack those open and take a look for certain files based on regular expressions that we can look for, certain files that define your script that you wish to run. We have a bunch of different types of, sorry, I'll just zoom out so you can see. We have a bunch of different package feeds that you can define. And these feeds can point to a number of arbitrary sources. So I can define feeds from a number of locations. So if I wanted to, I could say, go use the package that's up on Docker, for example, or I've got a GitHub repository somewhere that I want to use, and I want to go find a package there. you can set these up as feeds, and then those feeds can be used as in conjunction with your deployments. All right, so I'm not going to define a new feed here, but simply I'll define an inline script. When I define an inline script, again, this is another option we have. You can define it in a number of different languages. Here, I can just simply utilize something like PowerShell, for example, and I can say write host, etc., and say hello world. This will actually execute this line as part of this deployment. Now, I know that a lot of folks are kind of wondering, like, listen, and as part of deployment, there's lots of variables involved. Well, don't worry, we have variable support. So we have a mustache notation that we integrate with part of this. So I can add these variables directly within my scripts, and my scripts will flow or be flexible to the environments or other types of parameters that I want to use. If I want to share variables across different steps, I can do that as well. I can also trigger different types of execution of things via these aspects as well. So we have a mechanism by which you can reference variables as part of this, which is great. There are bunch of other settings here that I can specify as well. I can specify things like where it's being executed, how it's being executed. There's a bunch of other conditions I can define as well. So I can say things like, listen, I only want this script to run in certain environments. So for example, I can say run for any environment, or only run in specific environments, or skip specific environments, for example. You might wonder, like, why would you want to do this? Well, in certain cases, certain steps will run and it makes sense. Like, let's take an example where you're doing deployment to production. That's a pretty privileged operation if you think about it, your infrastructure. And you may want to notify folks via Slack, for example, that, hey, we're going to go and update prod. That's a privileged that is a sort of special special operation that you might want to conduct in only certain scenarios when you're, for example, deploying to production. And so in those examples, deploying to production is a pretty important thing. And you only want to run a certain step when that occurs. So you have that option there if you so wish, which is great. This is live. So hello, there you go. Hi from Codes. Hey, how's it going? So you can see this is live. So there you go. Awesome. So these deployment processes you define one after another, and then as you define them, they show up in your process editor here. So this well that occurs. Now, if I take a look at this option here, you can see I've defined a bunch of settings here. I can certainly do these releases if I wanted to, for example, and I could do these deployments very easily. You can see I've done deployments for this as well. When you issue a deployment, you get this release execution that occurs, and you set this up, and it shows up as part of your timeline. So if I take a look at my timeline here, you can see all the deployments that I've done over time. And this gives me a running log of everything that I've gone and done a deployment to, including failures. So if a failure occurs, I can diagnose that, for example, if I wanted to. The way that we set these up is we set these up as a release. So I can create a release here if I wanted to. And then when I create a release, I can schedule that release to occur. I can denote what packages I wish to execute, what packages I wish to ship. So I get full granular control over how things ship and when. I can also denote the version for this as well if I want. I can also specify incremental values here, like variables. I can base this on a bunch of things as well. So these and other options are available for you to use. Extremely powerful for utilizing Octopus going forward, which is fantastic. All right, so there you go. That is the sort of bare bones demo of what Octopus is. Obviously, there's a bunch of other things I need to show you, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what Octopus is from a primitive perspective. So we saw in that demo, we saw projects, you saw deployment processes, you saw a little bit of releases. We haven't talked about environments, we haven't talked about tenants, we haven't talked about anything else. There's lots of powerful features to Octopus. There's a feature, there's a feature called runbooks we can also talk about. But I just wanted to show you those in the first demo. Don't worry, we're not done with the demos. We're going to do lots more. All right, so what you saw basically a visual representation of how a deployment actually executes. So you get a visual representation of what these things look like. These will represent all the orchestration you do for things like doing conditions, for things like steps, etc. You can put conditions on these that allow you to control the flow of how these things work. You can also have things like child steps, for example. So you can have these things based on conditions, or you can have them fan out in the form of child steps as well. We have integrated Markdown. It's really important because obviously Octopus is going to be the sort of central point for all your teams. And so you may want to annotate your steps so that people can understand what these deployment processes do. We have parallel step execution as well. So not only do you have control via conditions and child steps, but you can also run these steps in parallel. You have environment labels. This relates to what I mentioned earlier. So when I was talking about how you want to do certain things in certain environments, like say, for example, production, these environment labels denote when these things run. So if I have three, let's say I have three environments, I have test, staging, and production. In this example here, you can't really see it, but down here it says staging. What that means is that this step will run by default in the staging environment. If I'm deploying to staging, it will run in that context. If I'm not, it won't. And so you can have these labels which represent when these steps occur, and you have that level of control, which is fantastic. Some other things I did want to mention, and again, this is kind of delving into other things that are related to Octopus. So one of the reasons why you use Octopus is, as I said before, it's part of your entire release orchestration process of software. And this covers everything from release versioning to environment promotion to deployment automation and everything in between. The reason why you use a tool like Octopus is because it's reliable and it's risk-free. You have the ability to roll back automatically changes that went into production that failed as part of that deployment. So we have a rollback mechanism built into Octopus that you can use. This means you can deploy on Friday. This means you can deploy on Saturday. This means you can deploy on Sunday. You should be able to deploy on Friday. I know that it's a big joke in our industry, like it's a meme, like, oh, I deployed on Friday and everything's on fire. Yeah, if you have a good deployment process and you're using a tool like Octopus, this shouldn't be an issue. Deploy on Friday should never have been a meme if you're using a tool like Octopus. And so utilizing a tool like Octopus allows you to get around that. We have also another facility in here, which is called Runbooks. This is part of your release management story. So if you're utilizing Runbooks, what this allows you to do is operations that relate to deployments. So things like server maintenance or restarting websites or updating a database. These and other types of operations you can contain within a runbook, which is like a deployment process, a series of steps that you run with elevated privilege based on what has been defined by admins in advance. And then a member of the team who has less privileges can execute those runbooks and perform maintenance because they've been pre-baked. So these are pre-baked runbooks that allow you to perform these operations in conjunction with other releases. And it's a really, really nice solution addition to Octopus that complements your release strategy. You're doing obviously integration with things like containers. We have support for that. We have integration with Kubernetes. I'll show you a little bit about that in a second. We also have a feature here called tenants. Now, tenants are really, really powerful because they allow you to represent your deployments based on basically where your customers reside and where your targets reside. And so I can represent my application utilizing these mechanisms called tenants. And if I wish, I can represent those mechanisms very easily. So multi-tenancy is actually a feature that a lot of customers love. And it's utilized heavily when more customers who are more mature in their use of Octopus deployment, Octopus for deployments, will use multi-tenancy as part of that. There's really nothing special about how this works. It's basically a feature that you can use, and it's available for you to use as part of this, but it allows you to represent these things really, really well. Another thing worth mentioning, of course, is the fact that everything is audited. So I showed you a little bit of the task log in that previous example, but everything is audited from the perspective of being able to see who did what, when, and where the changes propagated. We also have integration with things like single sign-on. We have ITSM integration. So if you're utilizing things like ServiceNow, for example, you can trigger a deployment via a change request approval in ServiceNow to then trigger downstream an automatic deployment via Octopus. So in a sense, you can actually use ServiceNow as an arbiter or a service mechanism for deployments using Octopus. All right, let's take a look at another demo. Obviously, my favorite part of doing this. So we talked a little bit about how these things look or how they work. Here's integration with things like runbooks. So runbooks are that integration I just described. These are similar to, in a sense, to deployment processes. They define a series of steps, and they tend to look pretty similar in terms of just the way that they're constructed. But the mechanism that you use them is in conjunction for maintenance operations. You can actually have these run based off a series of triggers if I wanted. So I could have a schedule trigger, which allows me to schedule these things to run if I wanted. There are other features as well that are bear mentioning. We can set up deployment freezes. So deployment freeze allows you to say, stop any deployments from this time period. And this might be, like say Christmas, for example, when everyone's away. And I can define a window where I don't want any deployments to occur. And when these things are set up, it will block essentially deployments from occurring. So these are other mechanisms you can certainly set up as part of your deployment process. The other thing I want to mention here is okay, so we've talked a little bit about how these things work within Octopus, but how do these things get triggered from outside of Octopus? So if we jump over, sorry for the context switch here, it's a little going from dark mode to light mode. So here I'm an example of a GitHub repo. You can see this one's called Octopus Shop. This is an example that we have baked that we use for a lot of folks. Inside of this GitHub repo, we have obviously a bunch of files and structures here. For my GitHub actions, this is in a well-known location, .github/workflows. And if we take a look at the YAML files that are in here, you can see I have a bunch of build scripts here. The way that this works is you'll define your build script, and it's defined similar to the way in which you define a deployment process. It's a series of steps. That's how GitHub constructs it as well. But down here near the bottom, you'll notice we're utilizing a set of actions that we have available. So these actions we've defined and made available within the GitHub marketplace. And you can use these to do a bunch of operations against Octopus. So we have things for like push package, create release, deploy release, etc. So these actions are available for you to use in conjunction with your build processes, whether they're hosted within GitHub or if you're utilizing something like Azure DevOps. So here's a pipeline that I've defined. I'm using the old UI for this just to show this, but we have integration here as well that you can use if you want. You can certainly use these steps as part of an integration within Octopus. So as part of your pipeline within Azure DevOps, you could actually go off and create a release, for example, things like that. We have integration also with TeamCity as well. This is actually the #1 integration listed on the JetBrains marketplace for TeamCity. So it's kind of like the peanut butter and chocolate combination. So TeamCity is very popular, and with Octopus, it's a very popular combination. And of course, Jenkins as well. So we have integration with Jenkins. So there's lots of integration points there. But just jumping back to Octopus, to GitHub, for example, if we take a look at, for example, the GitHub marketplace, there are a number of ways in which you can integrate with Octopus. So you simply search for Octopus, if I can type, and you'll find our GitHub actions listed there. That includes installing our CLI if you want. So we have a CLI that I'll show in a second here that you can use as part of this if you wanted. But we also have an app that you can use. So if you don't want to do this all explicitly, you can define and add an app that will auto trigger these deployments if you so wish. So we have integrations there. We also have an integration within this for the extension with GitHub Copilot. So if you're using GitHub Copilot, you can use Octopus in conjunction with that as well. But these are all defined as part of the marketplace. All right, so let me fire up the terminal here that I have. Awesome, everyone's favorite environment. So we have a CLI that you can use. And of course, no CLI is complete without a cool ASCII art representation of this. But excuse me. Got the drink right here so I can clear the throat. Apologies for that. So this is a CLI that we have available. So if you're wanting to trigger these via some background process and you're wanting to use a command line tool, you can do that. You can call our APIs as well. You can do that as well. The CLI allows you to interface with Octopus, and you can do a bunch of operations against Octopus via the CLI. The nice thing about the CLI as well is when you execute this and you, like, say, for example, want to do something with a project, for example, or you want to create something, if you don't give enough parameters for this, and this, one of the things we do is we actually kick you into a mode called interactive mode. So typically in a CLI, it's typically used in an automation context, but we realize that a lot of people run these facing the computer. And so we don't want to just drop it on the floor. If you don't write the command perfectly, we want to just be like, yeah, we don't understand what you're saying, just leave you alone. If you don't give enough parameters here, like we haven't done here, we'll kick you in interactive mode and we'll say, hey, listen, you didn't give us enough information. What do you want to do? And interactive mode allows you to do things like, hey, I'm going to go ahead and I want to create a project inside a space. And inside that project, I want to give it a name. And then I can set up a life cycle as part of this. So we kick you into this mode where you can just simply like, hey, here's how it does. Here's how you can integrate with it. And then at the end, we give you the automation command. We spit it out and we say, hey, this is what the automation command looks like if you want to run this in an automation context. So that's the CLI there, which is kind of cool. Awesome. So the CLI allows you to integrate with that in the backend if you so wish. but you can utilize our GitHub Actions as well. There's lots of different options there available for you, which is always good stuff. Awesome. So there you go. 35 minutes, 30 minutes roughly. You learned a lot of things in this webinar. You learned about how it works, why you might want to consider using it as part of your deployment pipeline. Obviously, there's a lot of other things that we can talk about. What I would encourage you to do is check out octopus.com to begin your journey. So if you go to octopus.com today, you can sign up for a free trial. Octopus, you can self-host, or you can sign up for Octopus Cloud, which allows you to utilize a hosted solution for this. Sign up for this today. Kick the tires. Let us know what you think. It's utilized by a bunch of customers, and it's a great solution for your deployments. As I said before, you should be able to deploy on Friday. This should not be an issue. And so Octopus gives you a mechanism for doing that, and you can test this out yourself. In addition to what you saw in terms of how it works and why you should consider using it, Octopus, we also talked a little bit about some of the fundamentals. So we touched very, very briefly on things like run books, projects, deployment processes. We talked a little bit about environments. You define those, of course. And we talked a little bit about releases. I showed you how to create a deployment process via a series of steps. We have a bunch of steps that are built into the product. If there's one that we don't include, the community has built one, so not to worry there. And then how to trigger those deployments through a CI process or server. I showed you how to do this in GitHub Actions. You simply annotate your YAML file with a bunch of actions we have based in the marketplace. We also have integration with TeamCity, integration with Azure DevOps, integration with Jenkins, etc. The list goes on and on and on. And of course, if you want to control everything, if you want to take the wheel yourself and run it yourself, you can use the CLI that we also have, which is fantastic. If you have any questions, you can reach me at john.bristowe@octopus.com. Alternatively, you can check out our YouTube channel, as I mentioned before. And finally, if you are of the reading type, we have an extensive docs library that we use. We update all the time. One thing I did want to just showcase here, just to kind of like convince you that some of the things that we're doing is kind of cool. We also have integration with AI as well. So we have an AI assistant that we've created here that allows you to do a bunch of operations. I can simply type into this, and I get the ability to do a bunch of operations against this via AI. So I can ask questions like, help me understand what an Octopus deployment project is. I can ask questions about various things that I don't have to search the docs for, but it is contextual. So if I jump around here, you'll notice that the view here for AI Assistant also changes. I can perform commands. I can do filters on this as well. I can say, hey, give me a list of check the space for duplicate project variables, and it will give me a listing of those values. So that's just something there to, that's like the wait, there's more sort of thing. Check that out. It's available up on the Chrome Web Store. We'd love to hear your feedback. But that, as they say, is the conclusion of today's webinar. I'll just check to see if there are any comments or questions. No, there are not. Great. That's a good thing or a bad thing, but there you go. We run these monthly. You'll find these up on our webinars page, which is at /webinars. So feel free to check that out. Make sure to register for our upcoming webinars. This is the 101 that we're doing right now. Coming up next week, we've got Bob and Phil Holloman, who's the field CTO of GitHub. Bob is our field CTO at Octopus Deploy. They're going to be doing a session entitled Fast and Compliant CI/CD Pipelines in Financial Industry. So if you want to learn more about that. We also have another webinar here entitled How We Progressively Deliver Changes to Kubernetes Using Canary Deployments and Feature Flags. Definitely worth checking out. That's on August 26th. We also have a show called Agro Impact. We have a bunch of other shows that we run as well, but check those out up at octopus.com/webinars. And that was just me tap dancing to see if there are any other questions coming in. I don't see any other questions, which is great. Awesome. So thank you for your time and attention. Really appreciate it. Remember, you can download a free trial today. Either run it yourself or set up your cloud instance if you so wish. No more questions. Great. Recording for this will be available up on our YouTube channel. And so thank you again for your time and attention. Really appreciate it. Until next time, on behalf of all of us, to all of you, happy deployments, everyone. As we like to say, happy deployments, everyone. Take care.